Hello everyone, my name is Julia Wunder, and in this talk I will present our paper Shedding Light on CVSS Scoring Inconsistencies, a user-centric study on evaluating widespread security vulnerabilities. So CVSS stands for the Common Vulnerability Scoring System, which is maintained by FIRST, and CVSS is used by many organizations and companies for vulnerability management. So with CVSS, a score can be calculated of a vulnerability, which then indicates the severity of the vulnerability. And with severity, the vulnerability then can be prioritized, for example. And so the problem now is that when there are different evaluators that evaluate the same vulnerability using CVSS, the resulting scores often differs in the end. And this should not be the case, as CVSS scores should be agnostic according to CVSS documentation. So the question here is, are CVSS evaluations consistent? And in our paper, we focused on CVSS version 3.1, as this was the most recent version back then. And to investigate this, we did a user study where the participants evaluated selected vulnerabilities using CVSS, and we then analyzed the resulting CVSS scores. So some more facts about CVSS. CVSS consists of a base score, and the base score consists of 8 metrics. And each of the metrics reflects another aspect of a vulnerability. So, for example, you have the metric attack vector. This metric indicates the location of the attacker. So, for example, if it's a remote attacker, you would evaluate this with network. If it's a local attacker, then the attacker has to be locally on a PC or something like that. So, during a CVSS assessment, you would evaluate each of these 8 metrics, and this results in the vector string. You can see it below. And the vector string just indicates how each of the metrics was evaluated. So, for example, AVN means attack vector network. Besides the vector string, there's also the CVSS base score. You can see it on the top right, which is calculated depending on the vector string. And this CVSS score indicates the severity. So the score can ranges from 0.0, which means non-severity, to 10.0, which means a high critical severity. And in this example, 7.9 would indicate a high severity. And in practice, these severity categories are often directly used in order to say, okay, this vulnerability has to fix immediately or within a week or something like that. Yeah, so that's the scoring system CVSS. Now to our study design and pre-studies. So in the beginning of our research, we conducted a discussion session with 3 CVSS experts where we talked about problematic vulnerability types and metrics. We then identified factors that might influence the CVSS scoring and also the consistency of CVSS scores. And we also identified problematic vulnerability types. We then selected widespread vulnerabilities that the participants later evaluated in the main survey. And to make sure that these selected vulnerabilities are suited for the main survey, we conducted a preliminary survey with 18 CVSS experts. After this, the selected vulnerabilities were slightly adjusted, and we conducted the main survey with 196 participants. And after this, 9 months later, we also conducted a follow-up survey in order to analyze if CVSS evaluations are also consistent over time. And in the end, we did the data analysis and evaluation of our research questions. So, and in this talk, I will present each of these 4 key points in our paper. So let's start with the preliminary studies. In fact, these consisted of 2 steps. So the first step was this discussion session with 3 CVSS experts. And here we discussed problems of CVSS they experienced in practice. And we also talked about problematic vulnerability types and also metrics that often cause discussions and problems when evaluated with CVSS. After the discussion session, we conducted a preliminary survey where 18 CVSS experts assessed 10 selected vulnerabilities. And we also provided the participants a free text field where they can share their opinion about CVSS, experience, and if they encounter any problems yet with CVSS. And these preliminary studies helped us with 3 key points. So the first thing was to collect and investigate problems of CVSS. We then examined further. It helped us to define our research questions. And most importantly, it helped us to identify and select widespread vulnerability types for the main study that the participants later then evaluated. So coming to the research questions, our first research question is, are metrics attack vector, user interaction, and scope inconsistently evaluated for some widespread vulnerability types? So in our paper, we focused on these three metrics, and these three were the most problematic ones according to the preliminary studies. Then the next research questions, are security deficiencies considered suitable for CVSS assessment by CVSS users? So security deficiencies are like a special case because these are not vulnerabilities on their own, but rather like something, missing security protection mechanism or something like that. So these are only become dangerous in combination with another vulnerability. And according to CVSS documentation, these should have a rating of none, but in practice, these are often given ratings from medium, even to high, even to critical. So the question here is, are these security deficiencies considered suitable for CVSS? The next research question, are personal factors associated with the individual differences in CVSS evaluations? So personal factors can be, for example, the work experience, the opinion of CVSS, how CVSS is handled at work, something like that. Then the next research question, what is the attitude of evaluators towards CVSS? So do they think CVSS is a useful tool, or do they think there are so much inconsistencies and that it's useless? And for the last research question, we want to know, are CVSS evaluations of the same evaluator consistent over time? So if an evaluator assesses the same vulnerability some weeks or even some months later, will it be the same CVSS score? And all of this were investigated in an online survey where the participants evaluated selected vulnerabilities. So coming to our main study, as I said, the preliminary studies helped us to identify pairs of problematic vulnerability types and metrics we investigated further. And the first pair is user interaction metric and XSS vulnerabilities. So the user interaction metric indicates if a user has to be involved when exploiting a vulnerability or not. So it can be none or required. And for reflected XSS vulnerability, here the user has to actively click on a link that a malicious script is executed. Whereas for a stored XSS vulnerability, here the malicious script is stored within a website. So each time a user visits the website, the malicious script is executed. So the question here is user interaction none, or is it required for stored and reflected XSS? The next metric we want to put our focus on is the scope metric. This metric is described as very ambiguous and hard to understand. And scope metric indicates if another system is affected by the vulnerability or not, at least from my understanding. And so here we focus on 3 different vulnerability types, and these are in fact the most severe vulnerabilities in the world, according to the CVE top 25 list of 2022. So here we want to know, is scope unchanged or changed for XSS, drive-by download, or SQL injection vulnerabilities. Next pair is attack vector metric and drive-by download vulnerabilities. So here is the question, is attack vector network or is it local if a file is downloaded from the internet but then locally opened on a PC? And for the last pair, here we want to know the attack vector metric and the man-in-the-middle vulnerability. So is attack vector network or is it adjacent for a man-in-the-middle? So adjacent means that the attacker has to be in a kind of logically or physically bounded network. So for example, in a Wi-Fi network. And the last thing we want to know is the suitability of security deficiencies. As I said, these are not vulnerabilities on their own. And here is the question, in particular, how to rate disclosing information on a web server version or a missing protection mechanism. And these pairs resulted then in selected vulnerabilities. And we had a total of 8 vulnerabilities and decided to divide the participants into 2 groups so that each participant has to evaluate 4 vulnerabilities in order to keep the survey time short. So that means for group 1, there was a stored XSS vulnerability, reflected XSS, SQL injection vulnerability, and as a security deficiency, we choose banner disclosure. And for each of these vulnerabilities, we focused on different metrics. So for example, here for stored XSS, we focused on the user interaction metric and scope metric. For group 2, here we had Adobe buffer overflow vulnerability and Chrome buffer overflow. These two were our drive-by download vulnerabilities. Then we also got a man-in-the-middle vulnerability, and finally HTTP only as a security deficiency. Okay, so coming to the results, for the demographics for the main study, we had about 196 participants, and on average the participants were about 38 years old. Most of the participants identified themselves as male. We only had some female and diverse participants. And considering the country of residence, here the most of the participants came from Germany, also from the United Kingdom. We had other European countries as well, like Spain, France, and Italy, for example. Also many participants from the US, from Asia, like I think most of them were from Japan, and other countries as well, like South Africa, for example. Then considering the education, most of the participants have an master's degree or also bachelor's degree. Then we also asked the participants to rate their self-expertise of CVSS version 3.1. And here most of the participants said they have advanced expertise or intermediate expertise. We also had many experts and a few that would say they have none experience or basic experience about CVSS. And one note here we explicitly asked about the experience with CVSS version 3.1, so not CVSS in general. Then we also asked how many years they have been using CVSS, and on average, our participants used CVSS since 6.7 years. So now to the results, and also short note here, I will only present some of the results to keep the talk short. So the first thing I want to show is the scope metric. And as I said, this metric is very difficult to understand. And this was very interesting because no matter the vulnerability, scope was always rated the same. So about 60% of the participants choose scope unchanged, whereas 40% of the participants choose scope changed. And yeah, so there were also many complaints about this metric that is hard to understand and very difficult. And one participant said something like, yeah, scope, ask 10 people and you get 10 coin cost. Ask 10 people and you get 10 coin tosses. Okay, now to user interaction. User interaction, as I said, implies if a user has to be involved when exploiting a vulnerability or not. And for reflected XSS, where the user actively has to click on a link, here about 75% of the participants said that is user action required. Whereas for stored XSS, where the malicious script is stored within a website, it is much more ambiguous how to rate user interaction. So here about, yeah, I think it was 55 or 60% rated it with user interaction required, and the other participants with user interaction none. So as you can see, in this case, user interaction metric is very ambiguous to evaluate. And in general, you can say that CVSS evaluations were not consistent in our study. The next thing I want to show is the severity, considering the security deficiencies. So the CVSS score then can be mapped on a severity category, these 5 categories, none too critical. And here we want to put our focus on the security deficiency, banner disclosure, and HTTP only. So for banner disclosure, it was very interesting that here was the highest agreement, as most of the participants evaluated it with a medium severity. But on the other hand, there were also the rating of non-severity the highest. Whereas for HTTP only, here was the most disagreement. So we had many participants evaluating it with medium severity, also with high, with low, and with none. So keep in mind that the severity rating is in practice often directly used as an indicator how fast a vulnerability has to be fixed. So yeah, so here you can see there's still confusion about how to rate the security deficiencies and if they are suited for a CVSS evaluation at all. Then we also asked the participants about the tool usage for CVSS assessment, and most of the participants used the CVSS calculator. Only a few use these official documents. These are specification, user guide, and examples document. And some participants also use internal software. Considering the official CVSS documents, here we also asked the participants to self-rate their knowledge about these documents and when they last consulted them. And this was also kind of surprising because most of the participants indicate that they have none or just basic knowledge. And they also consulted the official documents some months, years, or even never. So here you can say, okay, the official documents tend not to be consulted very much, but the CVSS calculator is on the other hand. So if there is a need for refining of metrics and for clarification, maybe this should also put into the CVSS calculator and not only in the official documents, as these are, rarely consulted. And finally, I want to talk about the attitude towards CVSS. Here we provided the participants different different statements, like, for example, CVSS is useful or CVSS is helpful, or there are much inconsistencies in scoring, something like that. And the participants could agree or disagree with these statements. So when looking at the positive statements, many participants agree that CVSS is useful and helpful, and they also like using CVSS. They also wanted to use in the future, so very positive attitude. And for the negative statements, here the participants agree that there are much inconsistencies in scoring and that the scores often differs. But they also don't think that the scores are useless. So here you can say that CVSS is perceived as a very useful tool, but its flaws are known to the users. So that's it for the results of the main study. Now coming to our follow-up study. In the follow-up study, 59 participants of the main study evaluated the same vulnerabilities again 9 months later. And with this, here we wanted to know, are CVSS evaluations also consistent over time? And for each participant, we provided 2 familiar vulnerabilities they also evaluated in the main study and 2 new vulnerabilities. So these were just vulnerabilities from the other group as kind of a distractor. So when looking at the results, here you can see that many participants choose another severity as in the main survey, explicitly for HTTP only. Here it were nearly 60% of the participants choose another severity as in the main survey. And keep in mind that the severity often indicates when a vulnerability has to be fixed, so this is kind of a problem. And in our follow-up study, you can say, okay, the evaluations were not consistent over time. So the follow-up study was 9 months later. Okay, so coming to the last part of my talk, one future work might be, so in our work, we focused on CVSS version 3.1, which was the most recent version back then. And last year, CVSS 4 was announced. So one possible future work can investigate the consistency of CVSS 4 scores. And I'm very happy to announce that this is something we're currently researching. And the survey for this is already running till the 1st of June right now. So if you're interested in the survey and want to participate, we will happy if you use this QR code. So it's a direct link to the survey. So to conclude my talk, in our paper, we examined the consistency of CVSS version 3.1. We conducted a preliminary studies to select vulnerability types and metrics that are most problematic in practice. We then conducted a main study to investigate the consistency of CVSS scores. And later, 9 months later, we conducted a follow-up study to investigate if CVSS evaluations are consistent over time or not. And in general, you can say that the CVSS evaluations were not consistent in our study. So if you want to know more about our research and about the results, you can read our paper, Shedding Light on CVSS Scoring Inconsistencies, a user-centric study on evaluating widespread security vulnerabilities. And to end my talk, I want to cite a very fitting statement from one of our participants. So CVSS is like democracy, the worst system available, except for all the other systems ever tried. Thank you.